The Sumerian King List names 8 rulers before the flood, records their reign lengths in multiples of 3,600 years, then interrupts itself with 4 words, "Then the flood swept over." What follows is not an explanation, it is a resumption, as though the event required no description because it was already understood. The difficulty appears before the text even begins. On the prism that preserves one of the most complete versions of the Sumerian King List, the first fully meaningful phrase does not introduce a world, a people, or a god. It reaches instead for a hinge, after kingship had descended from heaven. The clay does not say when this happened, or from where it descended, or to whom it first appeared. It opens on an after, as if the crucial event had already been agreed upon elsewhere, and as if the role of this document were only to proceed from a starting point that the reader is expected to bring with them. What follows this suspended beginning is not an explanation but a procedure. The list moves into its formula with an almost mechanical calm. A city is named. Kingship is said to be in that city. A sequence of rulers is recorded with reign lengths that appear both implausible and meticulously calculated. And then the city is said to have fallen with kingship moving on. Each clause is complete, but the larger frame remains unstated. The text does not ask how it came to be that kingship could descend, nor what it means for such an abstraction to reside in one city and not another. It records only that by the time the list is written, this is the condition under which history is to be organized. The phrasing, "after kingship had descended from heaven," gives the appearance of a summary of an earlier episode, one that would naturally be expected in a narrative or mythological composition. Yet the King List does not shift into narrative mode. It does not describe an assembly of gods, a decision, or a transfer of power. Instead, the sentence treats the descent as a bureaucratic preface, a fixed premise, recorded in a subordinate clause which allows the main work of the tablet to proceed. In that sense, the first line functions less as the opening of a story and more as the heading of a file that has been placed on a shelf already crowded with records whose contents are no longer recited. The material context of the prism reinforces this impression. The text is inscribed in neat columns, with care taken to keep the formulae regular and the layout consistent. The physical organization suggests a reference object, something meant to be consulted and copied, not an experimental or exploratory composition. Within that constrained format, there is little room for digression. The scribe has chosen, among all the possible beginnings, to allocate only a dependent clause to the question of how kingship entered human affairs. The rest of the surface is reserved for names, numerals, and the transfer of authority from city to city. The structure that follows the opening clause repeats a small set of expressions with near ritual stability. In city, Ping became king. He ruled number years. The grammar of becoming is clear and simple. What remains unstated is how the possibility of becoming king is grounded. The list does not describe the formation of a city council, or the gradual accumulation of power by a leading household, or any of the processes that might be associated with political development. Instead, kingship is treated as a pre-existing office that arrives, is allocated, and then is relocated, as if it were an item in an inventory rather than an institution emerging from human conflict and agreement. The absence of an origin narrative is all the more striking when compared with other Mesopotamian compositions that do attempt to describe beginnings. Elsewhere in the cuneiform corpus, one encounters accounts of how cities were founded, how temples were established, how the earth and the heavens were separated. Those compositions use different verbs, different temporal markers, and often extended scenes to stage the emergence of order. The King List, by contrast, refuses that mode. Its after does not invite elaboration. It closes it off, turning what could be an opening question into an archived assumption. This choice in framing has implications for how the list defines its own scope. By anchoring itself in an unspecified after, the document places the decisive transition outside its own jurisdiction. The scribe's responsibility begins only once kingship is already present and operative. Everything that precedes that state is treated as belonging to another kind of record, perhaps another genre, perhaps another level of access. The King List is, in this sense, an instrument of delimitation. It chronicles what happens once a certain structure is in place, but it does not speak about how that structure came to be. The first line marks the boundary between what is inside the archive and what remains outside. Even within the text's own internal chronology, this boundary persists. The earliest rulers mentioned, including those with reigns measured in units that far exceed any human lifespan, are not introduced as founders. They appear as the first occupants of an office that has already descended. They are not depicted as inventing kingship, or as being recognized by a community that needed leadership, but as receiving a role that has been assigned from elsewhere. In effect, the list begins not with creation but with succession. The first recorded act is not the establishment of a system, but the filling of a position that is treated as already defined. This approach to beginnings also shapes the way the text organizes time. The list does not provide a total number of years before the descent of kingship. It does not concern itself with eras that precede the office. Time, for the purposes of this document, becomes measurable and recordable only once kingship has descended. The clause, after kingship had descended from heaven, therefore acts as a temporal threshold. On one side lies an undefined expanse. On the other side, the precise though sometimes extravagant numerals of reign lengths and city tenures. The archive assigns value to the latter and passes over the former in silence. From the perspective of scribal practice, this silence seems deliberate rather than accidental. The King List is a carefully copied text, transmitted in multiple manuscripts over centuries. The opening formula is stable, its wording preserved even as other parts of the list vary. If there had been a tradition of expanding the beginning into a fuller narrative, one might expect at least some copies to contain that elaboration. Instead, the manuscripts that survive maintain the same compressed structure, repeating the after without attempting to explain it. The consistency suggests that the omission is part of what defines the genre of the list itself. For a listener following the sequence of names and cities, the absence of an origin account can recede into the background, overshadowed by the movement of kingship from one urban center to another, and the dramatic contrast between immense early reigns and more modest later ones. Yet the opening clause remains in place, quietly asserting that the most consequential transition, the moment when kingship first enters human history, is not something this document will describe. It will only acknowledge that such a moment exists and proceed from there. The archive, in other words, begins in the middle by design. Set against the precision of its later entries, the King List's refusal to narrate its own starting point raises a simple but persistent question. In a document so committed to recording after, what would it have meant for the scribe and for the culture that preserved his work to write down what came before? In the middle of its steady sequence of cities and kings, the Sumerian King List breaks its own rhythm with 4 spare words. Then the flood swept over. The formula that has been guiding the reader: kingship in a city, a line of rulers. The fall of that city is suddenly interrupted by an event that is not dated, not localized, and not described in any detail. The list does not say which river rose, which embankments failed, or which temples collapsed. It simply places the flood as a dividing line, as if the details of destruction belonged to another category of record altogether. Up to that point, the text has behaved like an orderly register. Kingship is said to be in a place. A king becomes king. His reign is measured. And then kingship is carried to another city when the first one falls. The verbs are procedural, administrative, focused on continuity and transfer. When the flood appears, however, it does not follow this pattern. Kingship is not said to move into or out of the flood. The flood does not become anything. It simply sweeps over, and the list resumes with a new city, a new starting point, as though an entire layer of time had been removed between 2 lines of text. The phrasing of the interruption is revealing. The flood is introduced with a temporal marker comparable to those used for political change. Then, but the structure of the sentence separates it from the usual clauses that govern kingship. It does not say that kingship ended with the flood, nor that it was suspended. It also does not claim that kingship descended again afterward. Instead, it allows the reader to infer that kingship, having already descended, crosses this boundary in some unstated way. The archive records the event, but refuses to record its effect on the office that defines the entire document. This refusal is not the result of a lack of space. The tablet has room for extended reign lengths, marginal notes, and occasional variations in wording. The scribe could have chosen to add even a brief elaboration that cities were destroyed, that shrines were submerged, that survivors rebuilt. Instead, the line is compressed to the point of abstraction. The flood is treated less as a story and more as a mark on a ledger, a line drawn through the preceding entries that signals an archival break rather than a narrative climax. The density of the phrasing makes the silence around it more conspicuous. The way the list proceeds after this break further underscores its function as a boundary. The next city appears without any transition other than the fact that the flood has swept over. There is no mention of resettlement, no account of how the new city comes to hold kingship, no hint of a struggle for succession. The formula of kingship, being in a city, returns unchanged, as though the office has simply emerged again in a new place, carrying its authority across an event that has erased other traces. The flood separates two segments of the list, but the bureaucratic logic on either side remains intact. From an archival perspective, this suggests that the flood is being used not to enrich the historical texture of the list, but to delimit its temporal architecture. Before the flood, kings reign for spans expressed in vast multiples, governed by a slightly different pattern of enumeration. After the flood, the numbers contract, the cities shift, and the overall structure of the list becomes more recognizably tied to known dynasties. The four-word interruption thus functions as a hinge between two regimes of timekeeping. It does not explain the change. It merely signals that a different kind of record begins on the other side. The minimalism of the line also distinguishes it from dedicated flood narratives elsewhere in Mesopotamian literature, where gods deliberate, warnings are given, and specific individuals are named as preservers of life or knowledge. Those compositions expand the flood into a scene with speeches, instructions, and sequences of days. The King List, by contrast, has no interest in such detail. Its concern is not how the flood unfolded, but where to place it in the sequence of kings and cities. By stripping the event down to its barest possible expression, the scribe turns a mythic catastrophe into an administrative marker. This administrative character becomes clearer when one considers how the list treats other transitions. When a city falls in ordinary circumstances, the text notes that it was smitten with weapons or defeated, and then calmly indicates that kingship was carried to another city. These entries are integrated into the flow, variations within an overarching continuity. The flood, however, is not described as a fall of a particular city. It is an encompassing event that appears to cut across the entire system, without assigning blame, cause, or even location. In archival terms, it resembles the closing of one file and the opening of another, rather than the simple recording of a defeat. The brevity of the interruption also implies assumptions about the expected reader. To write only "then the flood swept over" and offer nothing further presupposes that whoever consults the list already knows what the flood refers to. It is not a flood or a great flood, but the flood, a term that draws on a shared mental archive beyond the clay surface in front of us. The King List is therefore not introducing new information at this point. It is aligning its own internal sequence with a wider pre-existing framework of memory and tradition that it declines to restate. Yet the list does more than simply nod toward that shared framework. By embedding the flood as a single clause between two distinct blocks of royal succession, it reclassifies the event from a subject of narrative to a structural boundary. The flood is not positioned as the climax of the document. It is a dividing line that the text crosses without changing its basic method. The scribe does not adopt a different style of writing on either side of the line. The formulas continue, the concern with reign lengths persists, and kingship remains the organizing principle. The flood is monumental in content, but minimal in form. Because the list is meant to be copied and transmitted, the stability of this four-word interruption across versions suggests that its role as an archival boundary was carefully preserved. Later scribes who updated or adapted the list could have removed or expanded the line, yet the structure is maintained. The boundary remains where it was first set, even as subsequent political realities are integrated into the post-flood section. The flood is thus fixed not just in the history that the text presents, but in the way the archive itself is organized through time. Taken together, these features raise a quiet problem that the text does not address directly. If the flood is important enough to divide eras and to be assumed as common knowledge, but not important enough to merit description within this document, what does that imply about the limits the scribes set on what belonged inside a king list, and what was to be kept outside it in other, now partly lost, accounts? The section of the Sumerian King List that precedes the flood is not simply older in content, it is structurally different in composition. The antediluvian portion uses a different set of grammatical conventions, a distinct pattern of enumeration, and what appears to be an independent literary origin that was later grafted onto the rest of the document. The reign lengths in this section are expressed almost entirely as multiples of 3,600, a figure that corresponds to the highest regular unit in the Sumerian sexagesimal system. The post-Diluvian section, by contrast, begins to introduce variation, smaller values, and eventually numbers that approach what could be considered historically plausible reigns. The boundary between these two systems is not gradual. It is abrupt, and it is marked by the flood. Linguistically, the antediluvian section employs formulae that suggest it was composed at a very early stage in the development of Sumerian written tradition. The numerical notation in the earliest forms of the list, when represented using archaic symbols, relies overwhelmingly on the two largest units available, the large circle representing 3,600 and the smaller circle representing 600. This means that the numbers are not arbitrary, but patterned. They are chosen to fit a specific notational economy, one that prioritizes simplicity and regularity over variation. The antediluvian kings, in other words, are not given random large numbers. They are assigned values that conform to a strict mathematical template, as though the reigns themselves were understood as expressions of cosmic order rather than historical duration. The post-Diluvian section, meanwhile, adopts a more flexible approach. Reign lengths become shorter and the range of values widens. The grammar begins to shift, reflecting developments in the language and in scribal practice that occurred over the centuries. The cyclical movement of kingship from city to city becomes the dominant organizing principle, and the list begins to incorporate real dynasties whose existence can be corroborated through other administrative records and archaeological evidence. What emerges is a composite text. One part appears to function as a cosmological preface, the other as a chronicle of political succession. This structural division suggests that the antediluvian section was not created as a historical register, in the same sense as the dynasties that follow. It was instead composed to situate the later material within a larger temporal and ideological framework. The antediluvian rulers are not described as establishing cities or founding institutions. They are simply said to reign, as though their function were to occupy time rather than to shape it. Their names are recorded, their reign lengths calculated according to a formula that seems designed more for symbolic coherence than for documentary precision, and then the section closes with the flood. The list does not describe what these kings did, only how long they held an office that is presumed to have existed from the very beginning. The difference in style also appears in how the two sections relate to divine intervention. The later portions of the king list are notable for their avoidance of divine actors in the process of dynastic change. Cities fall, kingship moves, and the list proceeds without invoking gods who decide or intervene. Yet the antediluvian section opens with the premise that kingship descended from heaven, a statement that implies divine origin but offers no description of divine deliberation. The gods do not appear as characters in the antediluvian list. They are simply the unstated source of the office that the early kings occupy. Once the flood has passed, even that implicit reference to divine origin recedes, and the list becomes a record of human cities and their rulers. From a scribal perspective, the integration of these two traditions into a single document raises questions about archival intent. The antediluvian section was evidently important enough to be copied and transmitted alongside the post-diluvian material, even though it operated according to different principles. This suggests that the purpose of the king list was not simply to provide a political history of Sumerian cities, but to anchor that history within a much older, more abstract temporal schema. The post-diluvian dynasties could be verified, contested, or adjusted by later scribes. The antediluvian section, however, remained stable, as though it belonged to a category of knowledge that was not subject to revision in the same way. The mathematical regularity of the antediluvian reigns reinforces this impression. When analyzed as products of base 60 arithmetic, the numbers reveal an underlying consistency that would not be expected if the reigns had been invented, arbitrarily or derived from oral tradition without calculation. The pattern implies that whoever composed the antediluvian section was working within a formal numerical system, one that assigned meaning to the structure of the numbers themselves. The reigns were not recorded because they represented actual historical durations, but because they expressed relationships within a cosmological framework that the post-diluvian scribes inherited and chose to preserve. This creates a literary problem. If the antediluvian section is cosmological rather than historical, and if it was composed according to principles that differ fundamentally from those governing the rest of the list, then the king list is not a single genre. It is a hybrid document, one that begins with a formal statement of temporal and political origin, and then transitions into a chronicle of known dynasties. The flood serves as the transition point, but the text does not explain how the reader is supposed to reconcile the two modes. It simply presents them in sequence, as though the difference were self-evident to anyone consulting the record. The fact that this hybrid structure was maintained across multiple manuscript traditions, despite regional variations in names and dynasties, indicates that the division between antediluvian and postdiluvian was understood as essential to the document's function. Scribes in Nippur, Larsa, and Susa copied the antediluvian section even when their own cities did not appear in it, and even when the reign lengths could not be understood as literal chronology. The section was preserved not for its documentary value, but for its role in framing the entire list within a larger understanding of time, authority, and continuity across catastrophe. The antediluvian problem, then, is not simply that the numbers are large or implausible. It is that the antediluvian section belongs to a different tradition of knowledge, one that uses the language of kingship, but applies it in a way that is detached from the concerns of later political records. The section does not develop or explain the office of kingship. It assumes it, enumerates it, and then closes with the flood. What follows is a different kind of list, one that engages with cities, conflicts, and successions that can be mapped onto known history. The two parts of the document exist side by side, but they do not speak in the same voice. If the antediluvian section was composed earlier and according to a distinct set of principles, then the question shifts from what the early kings did to why their reigns were preserved in a form that made them unrecognizable as history, and why that form was considered necessary to place at the beginning of a document that would otherwise function as a royal chronicle. The most complete surviving manuscript of the Sumerian King List is inscribed on a clay prism, known by its museum catalog designation, Weld Blundell 444. It was acquired in the early 20th century from a dealer in Baghdad and eventually donated to the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, where it remains. The prism is a four-sided object, carefully shaped and baked, with columns of cuneiform running vertically down each face. The text begins at the top of one side and continues methodically around the object, creating a physical structure that mirrors the temporal structure it describes, a continuous record that must be turned read and followed through a fixed sequence. The physical form of the prism indicates that it was made not for casual consultation, but for deliberate preservation. It is a monumental copy, intended to present the entirety of the list in a single durable object. The script is clear, the layout regular, and the surface polished. Yet despite this care, the text begins without introduction. There is no colophon explaining who commissioned the prism, no dedicatory formula naming a temple or a king, and no statement of purpose clarifying why this particular sequence of names and numbers was considered important enough to inscribe in such a permanent form. The object presents itself as complete, authoritative, and self-explanatory, even though the text it preserves opens with a dependent clause that assumes the reader already knows what has been omitted. This assumption of prior knowledge is visible in the way the prism handles its content. It does not pause to define kingship, nor does it explain what it means for kingship to descend from heaven. It does not describe the cities it names, nor does it provide any geographic or historical context for the dynasties it lists. The reader is expected to recognize Eridu, Batabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak as the 5 antediluvian cities, and to understand that these names carry significance beyond their appearance on the clay. Similarly, the flood is mentioned in passing, without elaboration, as though the event required no description, because it was already embedded in the shared memory of anyone who would consult such a document. The prism's status as a reference object is further suggested by its placement within the broader tradition of Sumerian scribal practice. King lists were copied repeatedly across centuries, and surviving fragments show that the sequence was maintained even as individual manuscripts varied in detail. The Weld Blundell prism represents one branch of this tradition, preserving a version that begins with the antediluvian kings and continues through dynasties known from other sources. Yet it does not present itself as a new composition. The text does not claim to be revealing previously unknown information, nor does it position itself as an argument or an interpretation. It is simply a record, laid out in order, assuming that the categories it uses and the framework it follows are already understood. This quality distinguishes the prism from other cuneiform documents that do provide context for their own contents. Temple foundation inscriptions, for example, often include detailed preambles explaining the circumstances of construction, the favor of the gods, and the intentions of the ruler. Legal texts describe the parties involved, the nature of the dispute, and the resolution reached. Even literary compositions frequently include introductory lines that orient the reader within a narrative or mythological setting. The King List, by contrast, offers none of this. It begins in medias res, not because it is fragmentary, but because its function presupposes that the reader does not need an introduction. The absence of a scribal signature or a dedication also sets the prism apart. Many cuneiform tablets include a colophon identifying the scribe who copied the text, the patron who commissioned it, or the archive in which it was stored. These colophons situate the document within a specific institutional and temporal context, allowing later readers to understand how and why it was produced. The well-bundled prism, however, contains no such information. The text concludes with the final dynasty and then stops, as though the act of recording the sequence were sufficient in itself. The scribe remains anonymous, the circumstances of the prism's creation unknown, and its original location a matter of speculation. This anonymity has implications for how the prism was understood within Sumerian culture. If the document did not require attribution, and if it was reproduced across multiple sites and periods without significant alteration to its core structure, then it likely functioned as a canonical text, something that belonged not to an individual or a single institution, but to a broader tradition of knowledge that was considered authoritative by virtue of its content rather than its authorship. The King List was not the work of a particular scribe. It was a structure that scribes inherited, maintained, and transmitted as part of their training and their responsibility to preserve the records of the past. The material durability of the prism also suggests that it was intended to outlast the political circumstances that it documents. Unlike administrative tablets that recorded daily transactions and were often discarded or recycled once their immediate purpose was served, the prism was fired to a hardness that would resist erosion and breakage. It was made to endure, as though the sequence it contained was understood to be more stable than the cities and dynasties it named. The archive, in this sense, was not simply a reflection of political authority. It was a structure that claimed continuity independent of any single ruler or regime. Yet the prism does not explain why this continuity mattered or to whom. It does not say who was expected to consult the list or under what circumstances. It does not describe how the sequence was to be used, whether as a reference for legal claims, as a template for ritual organization, as a pedagogical tool for scribal students, or as something else entirely. The object presents itself as necessary, but it does not articulate the grounds of that necessity. It simply exists, inscribed with precision, preserved with care, and transmitted across generations as though its purpose were too obvious to require statement. This raises a persistent archival question. If the well-bundled prism was made to be read, and if the text it preserves assumes that the reader already possesses certain knowledge, where was that knowledge recorded and why has it not survived alongside the list that depends on it? Eridu is named in the Sumerian King List as the first city to receive kingship after it descended from heaven. According to the list, 2 kings ruled there for a combined total of 64,800 years before kingship was carried to Badabira. The city occupies a privileged position in Sumerian tradition, appearing repeatedly in later compositions as the original seat of divine authority and the dwelling place of Enki, the god associated with wisdom, fresh water, and the ordering of human institutions. Given this status, one would expect that excavations at Eridu would have uncovered texts describing the origin of kingship, the descent of the Mi, or the establishment of the first temple. Yet the tablets recovered from the site contain none of this. The archaeological work conducted at Eridu in the mid-20th century exposed a long sequence of temple construction, with multiple phases of rebuilding that extended back into the Ubaid period, well before the appearance of writing. The temples were arranged in a consistent pattern, with each new structure built directly over the remains of the previous one, suggesting a continuity of ritual practice that spanned millennia. The sequence demonstrates that Eridu was indeed an ancient and ritually significant site. What it does not demonstrate is any interest, on the part of the city's scribes, in explaining why this was so. The tablets found in the vicinity of Eridu's temples are overwhelmingly administrative. They record offerings, account for labor, list goods distributed to temple personnel, and track the movement of grain and livestock. The language is functional, repetitive, and narrowly focused on the management of resources. There are no myths of foundation, no hymns celebrating the first descent of kingship, and no cosmogonic narratives that would clarify the city's role in the larger structure of Sumerian belief. The archive at Eridu, in other words, does not contain texts that explain Eridu. It contains texts that assume Eridu's significance and proceed directly to the work of maintaining the institutions that significance supported. This absence is not the result of poor preservation or incomplete excavation. Other Sumerian cities have yielded literary compositions, including hymns, laments, and mythological narratives that describe divine action, the founding of temples, and the establishment of kingship. Nippur, for example, was a center of scribal education and produced numerous copies of compositions that describe the origins of various aspects of Sumerian civilization. Uruk's literary remains include references to the walls, built by Gilgamesh and the assembly of gods who granted authority to rulers. Yet Eridu, the city that the King List places at the very beginning of the sequence, has produced no comparable material. Its archive is silent on the question of its own origin. One possible explanation is that Eridu's role as the first city was understood to be so fundamental that it did not require textual elaboration. The city's position in the King List and in other compositions may have been sufficient to establish its primacy, making a separate origin narrative redundant. If this is the case, then the absence of cosmogonic texts at Eridu would reflect a scribal culture that distinguished between what needed to be recorded and what could be transmitted through other means: ritual practice, oral tradition, or simply the physical presence of the temple itself, rebuilt generation after generation on the same sacred ground. Another possibility is that the texts describing Eridu's foundation were kept elsewhere, in archives that have not survived or have not yet been discovered. Nippur served as a central repository for many compositions, and it is plausible that narratives about the origin of kingship and the descent of divine authority were stored there rather than in the cities to which they referred. This would imply a division of archival labor, with some cities functioning as centers of record-keeping for the entire Sumerian cultural sphere, while others focused on the practical administration of their own institutions. Under this model, Eridu's archive would be exactly what it appears to be: a working collection of administrative documents, not a repository of foundational mythology. Yet even if one accepts that origin narratives were centralized in Nippur or another scribal hub, the question remains why the archive at Eridu does not contain even a single reference to the events that the King List associates with the city. The tablets do not mention the descent of kingship, the reigns of Alulim or Alaugr, or the transition to Batabira. They do not engage with the cosmological framework that places Eridu at the beginning of human history. They simply record the ongoing operation of a temple system that is treated as already established, already legitimate, and already embedded in a larger network of cities and divine relationships. This pattern is consistent with what is found in other Sumerian archives. The vast majority of cuneiform tablets are concerned with the present moment, with contracts, inventories, ration distributions, and the documentation of transactions that have immediate practical consequences. Even when literary texts are produced, they tend to focus on the maintenance of order rather than its creation. Hymns praise the gods and the kings, but they do so by emphasizing continuity, stability, and the fulfillment of obligations that are already understood to exist. The archive, in this sense, is oriented toward preservation rather than explanation. The absence of cosmogonic material at Eridu thus reflects a broader characteristic of Sumerian record-keeping, the tendency to begin in the middle, to document what is operative rather than what is originary, and to treat the most fundamental structures of civilization as given rather than as subjects of inquiry. The city that the King List places first in the sequence of kingship has left behind an archive that does not describe how kingship came to be there. It describes only what happened once kingship was already in place: the distribution of offerings, the organization of labor, and the quiet, repetitive work of maintaining a system whose origin lies somewhere outside the scope of the tablets themselves. If Eridu, the city named as the first recipient of kingship, did not record the event that defined its place in Sumerian tradition, then where, if anywhere, was that event considered worth documenting? And what does its absence from the city's own archive suggest about the kinds of knowledge that Sumerian scribes chose to preserve? The Sumerian language contains a small set of formulaic phrases that appear at the beginning of administrative texts, and their grammar reveals something unexpected about how Sumerian scribes understood the systems they were documenting. These opening phrases do not introduce new institutions or describe the establishment of procedures. They signal instead that the activity being recorded is part of an ongoing process, one that began before the tablet was written and will continue after it. The language itself assumes continuity, and in that assumption, it quietly brackets off the question of origin. One of the most common administrative formulas uses the phrase luba, which translates roughly as on that day, or at that time. The phrase situates the transaction or the record within a temporal sequence, but it does not explain where that sequence begins. It simply anchors the present entry to a moment that is understood to be part of a larger flow. The phrase does not say when this system was established or after the temple was founded. It says, at that time, as though time itself is a continuous medium in which the institution is already operating. The scribe's task is not to describe how the system came into being, but to mark a point within its operation. Another recurring structure involves the verb sum, meaning to give or to deliver. Tablets that record offerings or distributions frequently open with a clause that names the item given, the recipient, and the institutional context, but they do not describe the origin of the obligation to give. The grammar treats the giving as expected, routine, and grounded in a framework that does not require restatement. The tablet documents the fulfillment of a responsibility, not the creation of that responsibility. The relationship between the giver and the receiver is assumed to be already defined, and the text proceeds on that basis. This grammatical tendency is even more pronounced in texts that deal with temple administration. The phrase gal, meaning palace or great house, and meaning temple or house, appear constantly in administrative records, but they are never introduced as though they were new concepts. The terms are deployed without explanation, as though the institutions they name are permanent features of the world in which the scribe operates. The tablets do not say when the temple was built or after the palace was established. They say from the temple or to the palace, using prepositional phrases that imply motion and transaction within a space that is already there. The same pattern appears in the language used to describe kingship itself. The term lugal, meaning king or great man, is used in administrative contexts to designate the office that authorizes or receives certain goods and services. Yet the term is not accompanied by verbs of creation or inauguration in these records. It appears instead in genitive constructions, possessive phrases, and prepositional clauses that treat kingship as an established fact. The king is not described as becoming king within the administrative archive. He is simply present, named, and functioning as a node in the network of transactions that the tablets document. This linguistic structure has implications for how Sumerian scribes understood the scope of their work. The administrative archive was not designed to capture the full history of the institutions it served. It was designed to record their ongoing operation. The grammar reflects this purpose. Opening phrases that signal continuation rather than creation are efficient, economical, and appropriate for documents that will be produced daily, weekly, or seasonally as part of a routine cycle. But the efficiency of the language also means that the archive systematically excludes narratives of origin. The tablets are written in a mode that assumes the reader already knows how the system began, or that treats the question as irrelevant to the practical task at hand. This grammatical orientation is consistent with the structure of the Sumerian King List, which opens with after kingship had descended, rather than with a description of the descent itself. The King List, though not an administrative document in the narrow sense, employs the same logic of resumption. It begins by positioning itself within a temporal sequence that is already underway, and it uses language that treats kingship as a transferred object rather than as an emergent phenomenon. The list does not describe the moment when kingship first appeared. It describes the movement of kingship from one location to another, using grammatical forms that emphasize continuity and succession rather than innovation or invention. The administrative tablets that survive from cities across Sumer reinforce this pattern. Whether they record grain rations distributed to temple workers, barley delivered to the palace, or labor obligations fulfilled by specific households, the tablets use language that situates each transaction within a system that is treated as stable and enduring. The verbs are repetitive, the formulas are fixed, and the grammatical structures are chosen to facilitate comparison across multiple entries rather than to provide narrative context. The archive, in this sense, is built to document process, not to explain precedent. This creates a linguistic gap that mirrors the structural gaps already visible in the King List and in the excavated archives of cities like Eridu. The language used to record the operation of Sumerian institutions does not contain the vocabulary or the grammatical forms that would be necessary to describe the establishment of those institutions. The archive speaks in a grammar of continuation, and that grammar, by its very nature, presupposes a beginning that lies outside the scope of the documents it produces. One consequence of this linguistic orientation is that the Sumerian textual record, despite its vast size, and its detailed attention to the mechanics of administration, does not contain a first-person account of institutional creation. The tablets do not say, "We built this temple," or "We established this office," in the way that foundation inscriptions from later periods sometimes do. They say instead, "From the temple," or "to the king," using language that treats the institution as prior to the act of writing. The scribe records what happens within the institution, but the institution itself is taken as given. The grammar of resumption thus functions as a kind of archival filter. It allows certain kinds of knowledge to be recorded with great precision quantities, dates, names, transactions, while systematically excluding other kinds of knowledge, particularly knowledge about how the system being documented came into existence. The language does not pose the question of origin, and in not posing it, the language quietly enforces the boundary between what belongs in the archive and what belongs elsewhere, if it is to be recorded at all. If the grammar of Sumerian administrative language is structured to describe continuation rather than creation, and if this grammatical tendency is consistent across thousands of tablets from multiple cities and periods, then the absence of origin narratives in the archive may not reflect a loss of knowledge, but a deliberate choice about what kinds of statements the archive was designed to preserve. The Sumerian term me refers to a concept that has no direct equivalent in modern languages, but which appears repeatedly in mythological and administrative contexts as something fundamental to the ordering of civilization. The me are described in various compositions as divine principles, cosmic decrees, or essential attributes that govern everything from kingship and priesthood to craftsmanship, law, and sexual behavior. They are treated not as ideas or values, but as tangible entities that can be possessed, transferred, stolen, or lost. What the texts consistently avoid, however, is any account of how the me came into being or who created them. In the composition known as Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and receives the me from Enki, who is described as their guardian rather than their maker. The narrative focuses on the transfer. Enki, influenced by drink, hands over the me to Inanna, who loads them onto her boat and carries them to her city of Uruk. Enki later regrets the transfer and sends servants to retrieve them, but Inanna successfully defends her claim and brings the me into her temple. The story is concerned entirely with possession and movement. It does not explain what the me are made of, how Enki came to hold them, or whether there was a time before they existed. They are simply present, and the conflict revolves around who has the right to control them. The me themselves are enumerated in lists that appear in multiple versions of the composition, and the lists reveal the breadth of what the concept encompasses. Kingship is a me. Priesthood is a me. The craft of the metalworker is a me. Truth, deception, descent into the underworld, the musical instruments used in temple ritual, all of these are counted among the me. The lists are not hierarchical in any obvious way, nor do they distinguish between what might be considered abstract principles and what are clearly practical skills or physical objects. The me are treated as a unified category of things necessary for the functioning of a civilized order, and they are presented as though they have always been necessary. This treatment of the me as pre-existing and complete is consistent with how other Sumerian compositions describe the establishment of order. In the myth known as Enki and the World Order, Enki travels across the land assigning functions to various cities, rivers, and regions and distributing the me to ensure that each part of the world operates according to its proper role. The text describes Enki as organizing what already exists, not as inventing the categories of organization. He assigns the me. He does not create them. The myth assumes that the me were already available to be assigned, and it focuses on the process of allocation rather than on the process of origination. The administrative texts that mention the me use similar language. When a temple inventory refers to cult objects associated with specific me, the language treats the me as attributes that are inherent to the objects, rather than as concepts that were imposed on them. A staff carried in a ritual procession might be described as embodying the me of leadership or authority, but the text does not say when or how that association was established. The me are simply there, embedded in the material culture of the temple, and the scribe's responsibility is to account for the objects, not to explain the metaphysical principles they represent. This creates a conceptual gap in the Sumerian textual record. The Mi are central to how the Sumerians understood the structure of their world, and they appear in compositions that span centuries and multiple cities. Yet there is no surviving text that describes their origin. They are not said to have been fashioned by the gods, nor are they described as emerging from primordial chaos or being decreed at a cosmic assembly. They are referenced constantly, but they are never derived. The archive assumes that anyone consulting the texts already knows what the Mi are and accepts their existence as a given. This assumption is particularly striking in educational contexts. Scribal students copied hymns and myths that referred to the Mi, and they would have encountered the term repeatedly during their training. Yet the curriculum did not include a composition that defined the Mi or explained their origin. The students learned to recognize the term, to use it correctly in context, and to understand its importance within the cultural and religious framework of Sumerian society. But they were not taught where the Mi came from, and the absence of such instruction suggests that the question was not considered relevant to the scribal function. The way the Mi are described in mythological contexts also reinforces their status as inherited rather than created. When Inanna brings the Mi to Uruk, she is celebrated not as an innovator but as a preserver. She has secured for her city something that already existed and that was necessary for its prosperity. The narrative does not suggest that Uruk would have developed its own Mi over time, or that the Mi could have been invented by human ingenuity. Instead, the city's success depends on receiving what was already present in the world, stored in Enki's temple at Eridu, and available for transfer if one could negotiate or seize access to it. This framework implies a model of civilization in which the most fundamental structures are not the result of human development or divine invention, but are instead part of the fabric of reality itself. The Mi are not made. They are there. The gods do not create them. They administer them. The cities do not generate them. They receive them. The entire cosmological and administrative system described in Sumerian texts operates according to principles that are treated as prior to the system itself, and the archive documents the maintenance and distribution of those principles without ever accounting for their origin. The language used to describe the Mi is the language of custody, not creation. Enki is the guardian of the Mi, not their author. Inanna is their recipient, not their inventor. The temples are their repositories, not their birthplaces. The entire Sumerian tradition, as it survives in cuneiform, presents the Mi as something that was inherited from a source that lies outside the narrative scope of the texts that depend on them. If the Mi are described consistently as objects that exist prior to their distribution, and if no surviving composition explains where they came from or who established them, then what does that imply about the Sumerian understanding of the source from which their entire civilization drew its organizing principles? The city of Uruk, known in later tradition as the seat of Gilgamesh and one of the most prominent urban centers in early Mesopotamia, presents an archaeological problem that mirrors the textual gaps found in the King List and the administrative archives. When excavators worked through the deep strata at Uruk in the 20th century, they encountered monumental architecture that appeared suddenly in the archaeological record, with no clear sequence of incremental development leading up to it. The massive walls, the large public buildings, and the complex layout of the sacred precinct did not emerge gradually from smaller, simpler structures. They appeared, fully formed and built to a scale that suggests centralized planning and coordinated labor on a level that had no visible precedent in the earlier layers. The earliest monumental phase at Uruk, known to archaeologists as Uruk IV, includes massive mud brick platforms, large columned halls, and a system of defensive walls that enclosed an area of considerable size. The construction techniques employed in this phase are sophisticated, involving the use of standardized bricks, architectural ornament in the form of cone mosaics, and spatial organization that implies an understanding of geometry and engineering. Yet the layers immediately beneath this phase do not show a gradual progression towards such complexity. The transition from the preceding period to Uruk IV is abrupt, and the scale of construction increases dramatically without a corresponding increase in the number of smaller structures that might indicate experimentation or trial phases. This pattern is not unique to Uruk's public architecture. The administrative systems that appear in the earliest written tablets from the city also lack visible antecedents. The texts from Uruk IV and the slightly later Uruk III period include lexical lists, accounting records, and administrative documents that use a developed system of notation and a standardized vocabulary for goods, titles, and institutional roles. The lists are already organized into categories. The numerical signs are already differentiated by function, and the scribal conventions are already stable enough to be reproduced across multiple tablets. There is no surviving archive from Uruk that shows a simpler, earlier stage in which the scribes were still working out how to represent quantities or how to categorize the contents of a temple storehouse. The walls themselves, which later tradition attributes to Gilgamesh, are built on a scale that suggests they were conceived as a permanent feature of the urban landscape from the moment of their construction. They are not small enclosures that were later expanded, nor are they defensive works added in response to an immediate threat. They are massive structures that enclose the city as a whole, implying that the decision to build them was made at a point when the city's boundaries, its population, and its need for protection had already been determined. The walls do not appear to be the result of incremental fortification over time. They appear to be part of an original plan. The archaeological evidence from Uruk's sacred precinct reinforces this impression. The area known as Ina, associated with the goddess Inanna, contains a series of large buildings that were rebuilt repeatedly over centuries, but the earliest phase already exhibits a level of architectural ambition that is difficult to reconcile with the idea of gradual urban development. The buildings are large, the layouts are complex, and the materials include not only mud brick but also stone and imported timber, indicating access to resources and trade networks that must have been well established by the time the first monumental structures were raised. This sudden appearance of monumental architecture and administrative complexity has led to considerable debate among archaeologists about what preceded Uruk IV. Some have proposed that the earlier phases were less well preserved, or that the development occurred in areas that have not yet been excavated. Others have suggested that the transition reflects a rapid centralization of political and economic power, perhaps driven by environmental or demographic pressures that forced populations to consolidate into larger, more defensible urban centers. Yet none of these explanations fully accounts for the absence of intermediate stages in the archaeological record. The city appears, and it appears with systems already in place. The textual tradition associated with Uruk reinforces this sense of sudden appearance. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the city's walls are described as the work of a single king, built according to a plan that was inspired by divine wisdom. The narrative does not describe a long process of construction or a gradual expansion of the city's defenses. It presents the walls as a completed achievement, something that can be admired and marveled at by anyone who approaches the city. The walls are not the product of generations of labor. They are the product of a deliberate act, carried out by a king who had access to knowledge and resources that allowed him to build on a monumental scale. The archaeological and textual evidence together create an image of Uruk as a city that did not grow slowly from a village or a cluster of settlements, but that emerged as an urban center with institutions, defenses, and administrative systems that were already operational. The city's walls stand as physical evidence of a level of organization that the earlier strata do not prepare the observer to expect, and the administrative tablets record a level of institutional complexity that has no visible prototype in the layers below. If Uruk's monumental architecture and administrative systems appeared without clear antecedents in the archaeological record, and if the textual tradition treats the city's construction as a deliberate act rather than a gradual process, then where did the knowledge and the organizational capacity required to build and administer such a city come from? The numerical system used in the earliest Sumerian tablets is based on the number 60, a system known as sexagesimal notation. This system is remarkably sophisticated, allowing for the representation of large quantities, fractions, and complex calculations using a positional notation that anticipates principles later employed in decimal systems. What makes the sexagesimal system particularly striking is that it appears fully formed in the earliest written records from Uruk, with no evidence of a simpler, intermediate system that might have served as a developmental stage. The scribes who produced the first administrative tablets were already using a base 60 framework, and they were already employing it with consistency and precision. The sexagesimal system divides quantities into units of 1, 10, 60, 600, 3600, and so on, with each level represented by a distinct sign or combination of signs. This allows for efficient notation of both small and large numbers, and it facilitates arithmetic operations that would be cumbersome in a purely decimal or vigesimal system. The choice of 60 as the base is not arbitrary. 60 is highly divisible, allowing for clean division by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes the system particularly well suited for administrative purposes, where goods must be divided into rations, distributed among groups, or converted between different units of measurement. The earliest tablets that employ this system come from the late 4th millennium, during the Uruk the 4th and Uruk III periods. These tablets record transactions involving grain, livestock, textiles, and labor, and they use numerical signs that are already standardized. The signs for 1, 10, 60, and higher units are consistently applied across multiple tablets, suggesting that the scribes were working within an established convention rather than experimenting with new forms. This absence of a prototype is difficult to reconcile with models of mathematical development that assume gradual evolution from simple tally marks to more complex notational systems. In other early literate cultures, one can often trace a progression from basic counting methods to more abstract systems of numeration. In Sumer, however, the progression is not visible. The earliest tablets already employ a system that requires not only an understanding of place value but also a shared agreement among scribes about how to represent different orders of magnitude and how to perform calculations that involve multiplication, division, and the conversion of units. The sexagesimal system also appears in contexts that suggest it was used not only for practical administration but also for more abstract or cosmological purposes. The antediluvian reign lengths in the Sumerian King List, for example, are expressed almost exclusively as multiples of 3,600 the square of 60. These numbers are not chosen for their administrative convenience. They are chosen because they fit within a mathematical framework that treats 60 and its powers as structurally significant. The use of sexagesimal notation in the King List implies that the system was understood to have a cosmological dimension, one that extended beyond the recording of grain rations and into the representation of time, authority, and divine order. The connection between the sexagesimal system and astronomical observation has also been noted. Later Mesopotamian astronomical texts use base 60 notation to record the positions of celestial bodies, the lengths of lunar months, and the cycles of planetary motion. The precision required for such observations suggests that the sexagesimal system was well suited to tasks that involved tracking small increments of change over long periods. Yet the earliest evidence for this use of the system appears centuries after the first administrative tablets, raising the question of whether the system was developed for astronomical purposes and later adapted to administration, or whether it was designed from the beginning to serve multiple functions. The mathematical elegance of the sexagesimal system has led some scholars to propose that it was not invented in isolation, but was part of a broader, intellectual tradition that included geometry, metrology, and perhaps early forms of algebra. The standardization of weights, measures, and architectural units in early Mesopotamia all suggest a level of mathematical coordination that would require not only practical skill, but also theoretical understanding. The ability to design a system that could serve such diverse purposes, recording transactions, measuring fields, calculating volumes, and tracking celestial cycles implies a level of abstraction that is difficult to attribute to gradual experimentation by administrators who were primarily concerned with counting sheep and barley. The absence of a simpler ancestor system also raises questions about transmission. If the sexagesimal system was fully operational by the time writing appeared, then it must have been developed and refined before the earliest tablets were inscribed. This would imply that mathematical knowledge in Sumer was transmitted through non-written means for a significant period, and that the decision to commit that knowledge to clay came only after the system had already been stabilized. The first tablets, in this view, would represent not the beginning of mathematical thought, but the beginning of its documentation. Another possibility is that the sexagesimal system was inherited from an earlier tradition that has left no material trace. If the system predates the written record, and if it was already standardized by the time scribes began using it to record transactions, then the origin of the system lies outside the scope of the cuneiform archive. The tablets document the use of base 60 notation, but they do not document its invention. The archive, once again, begins in the middle, recording the operation of a system whose creation remains unaccounted for. The consistency of the sexagesimal system across the earliest Sumerian sites also suggests that it was not developed independently in multiple locations. Uruk, Ur-Nippur, and other early cities all use the same basic framework. with minor variations in sign forms but no fundamental differences in structure. This implies either a common origin or a rapid diffusion of mathematical knowledge across southern Mesopotamia at a very early stage. In either case, the uniformity of the system points to a level of coordination that is difficult to explain without some form of centralized intellectual authority or shared tradition. The sexagesimal system thus presents the same pattern visible in the King List, the administrative archives, and the architectural record. A fully developed structure that appears without visible antecedents operates with consistency from its earliest attestations and is maintained across centuries without significant alteration. The system is not experimental, it is established. It is not evolving. It is already complete. If the base 60 numerical system was fully operational in the earliest written records with no evidence of a simpler prototype, then where was the mathematical knowledge necessary to design and standardize such a system developed, and why was it not recorded in the same archive that depends on it for every calculation? The temple archives recovered from Sumerian cities contain thousands of tablets that record the day-to-day economic activity of religious institutions. These tablets document the movement of grain, the allocation of rations to workers, the distribution of wool and textiles, and the assignment of labor to specific tasks. The records are detailed, methodical, and often repetitive, preserving information about quantities, dates, personnel, and the flow of goods through the temple household. What they do not contain is any explanation of why the temple operates as it does, or how the economic system it administers came to be established in the first place. A typical temple household tablet might list the amount of barley distributed to a group of laborers, specifying the quantity per person, the duration of the ration period, and the name of the official responsible for the distribution. The language is formulaic, using standardized phrases that indicate the movement of goods from one administrative category to another. The tablet records the transaction, but it does not describe the institutional framework that makes the transaction meaningful. It does not say why the temple is responsible for feeding laborers, or how the temple came to control the resources necessary to fulfill that responsibility. It simply documents that the distribution occurred in a manner consistent with previous distributions, according to a system that is treated as self-evident. This pattern is visible across the entire spectrum of temple economic records. Tablets that track offerings to gods, payments to craftsmen, or the allocation of land to temple dependents all operate within a framework of assumptions that are never made explicit. The gods are owed offerings, the craftsmen are entitled to payment. The dependents have claims on temple land. All of these relationships are treated as established facts, and the tablet serves only to verify that the obligations have been met. The archive does not explain how the obligations were created, or who decided that the temple would serve as the central institution for organizing economic life in the city. The economic function of the temple is particularly striking when compared with the absence of comparable institutions in the archaeological record of earlier periods. The temple household, as it appears in the cuneiform archive, is a complex organization that manages production, storage, distribution, and labor allocation on a large scale. It functions as a redistributive center, collecting surplus from agricultural production and reallocating it to support specialists, administrators, and ritual personnel. Yet there is no surviving record of a transitional phase in which smaller, simpler institutions gradually developed the capacity to perform these functions. The temple household appears in the archive as a fully operational economic unit, with established categories of personnel, standardized ration levels, and a bureaucratic structure capable of producing written records of every transaction. The tablets themselves reflect this bureaucratic sophistication. Many of them are not isolated records but parts of larger accounting systems, with summary tablets that aggregate information from multiple transactions and archive tablets that preserve records over extended periods. The existence of such systems implies that the temple scribes were not simply documenting individual events, but were maintaining a coherent archive that could be consulted for reference, audited for accuracy, and used to plan future allocations. The level of organization required to produce and maintain such an archive suggests that the temple household was operating according to principles that had already been worked out in detail before the earliest surviving tablets were written. The silence on institutional origin is particularly notable in tablets that deal with land tenure and labor obligations. These tablets describe fields assigned to specific individuals or groups, often in exchange for service to the temple or the palace. The assignments are recorded with precision, specifying the size of the field, its location, and the terms of the arrangement. What the tablets do not record is how the temple came to own the land in the first place, or how the system of service obligations was established. The archive treats land as a resource that the temple administers, and it treats service as an obligation that certain people owe, but it does not explain the origin of either the ownership or the obligation. This absence extends to the relationship between the temple and the palace. In many cities, the economic archives show that temple and palace households operated in parallel, each managing its own resources and personnel, and occasionally coordinating on larger projects. The tablets document transfers of goods between the two institutions, joint labor assignments, and shared responsibilities for certain types of production. Yet the archive does not describe how the division of authority between temple and palace was determined, or whether there was ever a single institution that later split into two. The relationship is simply there, embedded in the structure of the records, and the scribes proceed on the assumption that the reader understands how the system works. The economic tablets also reveal a high degree of standardization in units of measurement, categories of goods, and administrative terminology. This standardization suggests that the temple households across different cities were operating according to shared conventions, and that there was some mechanism for maintaining consistency in how transactions were recorded and how resources were managed. Yet the archive does not describe how these conventions were established, or who had the authority to enforce them. The standards are simply applied, as though they were part of the natural order of things. The Temple Household Archive thus presents the same pattern visible in other categories of Sumerian texts: a detailed and precise documentation of process, coupled with a complete silence on precedent. The tablets tell us what the temple did, how often it did it, and who was responsible for doing it. They do not tell us why the temple existed, how it acquired its authority, or when the economic system it administered first came into being. If the temple household operated as a complex redistributive institution from the earliest written records, with no surviving account of its establishment, then what does that imply about the source of the institutional knowledge that made such organization possible? The Sumerian term for kingship is nam lugal, a compound that combines nam, meaning something like condition or state of being, with lugal, meaning great man or big man. The term appears throughout the cuneiform record in contexts that treat kingship not as a political arrangement that emerged from human society, but as an office that was already defined and that individuals were appointed to occupy. The language used to describe kingship reinforces this understanding. Kings are said to receive nam lugal, to hold it or to exercise it, but they are not described as creating it or as being the first to establish it. The office precedes the occupant, and the terminology reflects that precedence. This grammatical structure is visible in the opening line of the Sumerian King List, which states that kingship descended from heaven. The phrase does not use a verb of creation or invention. It uses a verb of movement, as though kingship were an object or a quality that could be transferred from one location to another. The term nam lugal in this context is treated as something that exists independently of any particular king, and that can be allocated to a city or a dynasty according to principles that are not made explicit in the text. The king does not become king by seizing power or by being recognized by a community. He becomes king by receiving an office that has been assigned to him. Administrative texts that refer to kingship use similar language. When a tablet records goods from the king or labor for the king, the term lugal appears in a possessive or prepositional construction that treats the king as a fixed point in the institutional landscape. The tablets do not describe the king as a political actor who has risen to power through specific actions or decisions. They describe him as an officeholder whose authority is assumed and whose role is already integrated into the administrative system. The king is not explained. He is simply present, functioning within a framework that the archive takes for granted. The stability of the term nam lugal across centuries of Sumerian writing suggests that the concept it names was understood in a consistent way throughout the period during which cuneiform was actively used. Scribal students learned the term as part of their training, copying lists of titles and offices that included nam lugal alongside other administrative and ritual roles. The term appears in lexical lists, in royal inscriptions, in hymns, and in mythological compositions, and in each context, it carries the same basic meaning. The office of kingship understood as a state or condition that is conferred rather than achieved. This understanding is reinforced by the way kingship is described in mythological texts. In compositions that deal with the relationship between gods and kings, kingship is consistently presented as a gift from the divine realm. The gods are said to grant nam lugal, to approve the king's rule, or to withdraw their support if the king fails to fulfill his obligations. The king's authority is thus grounded not in his own power or in the consent of the governed, but in his relationship to a divine order that predates and transcends the human political sphere. The gods do not create kingship in these texts. They administer it, choosing which individuals or which cities will hold it at any given time. The term nam lugal also appears in contexts that suggest it was understood as one element within a larger set of cosmic principles. In texts that refer to the Emi, kingship is listed as one of the divine attributes that were distributed to organize the world. It is placed alongside priesthood, craftsmanship, law, and other essential components of civilized life, suggesting that kingship was not seen as a uniquely political institution but as part of a broader cosmological framework. The king, in this view, is not simply a ruler. He is the human representative of a principle that has its origin in the divine order. The absence of narratives describing the invention or emergence of kingship is particularly notable given the richness of Sumerian literature in other areas. The archive contains numerous compositions that describe the founding of temples, the building of cities, and the establishment of specific rituals or legal practices. Yet there is no surviving composition that describes the first king or the moment when human beings decided that they needed a ruler. The closest the texts come to addressing the question is the statement in the King List that kingship descended from heaven, a phrase that closes off inquiry rather than opening it. The origin of kingship is placed in the divine realm, and the archive proceeds from there without further elaboration. This silence is consistent with the treatment of other foundational institutions in Sumerian texts. Just as the temple household is documented without explanation of its origin, and just as the sexagesimal system is used without description of its invention, kingship is recorded as an operational office without any account of how it came to exist. The term nam lugal names a condition that is already present in the world, and the scribes who use the term are concerned with documenting who holds that condition, for how long and under what circumstances it is transferred. The question of where the condition came from is not addressed within the archive. The consistency of this terminology across multiple cities and dynasties also suggests that kingship was understood as a supralocal institution. The King List itself makes this clear by describing kingship as moving from one city to another, rather than existing independently in multiple places at once. Kingship is a singular office, and the holder of that office may change, but the office itself remains constant. The term nam lugal reflects this singularity, referring not to a type of authority that different rulers might exercise in different ways, but to a specific condition that can be held by only one entity at a time. If kingship is described in Sumerian terminology as an office that was received rather than invented, and if the archive contains no account of how that office was first established, then what does the language of nam lugal imply about the source from which Sumerian political authority was understood to derive? Nippur functioned as a central site of scribal education in Sumer, and the tablets recovered from its archives reveal what subjects were considered essential for the training of literate professionals. The curriculum was built around the repeated copying of fixed lists, lists of gods, lists of cities, lists of professions, and lists of objects used in temple ritual. These lists were not explanatory texts. They did not provide narratives about how the gods came to be, or how the cities were founded, or why the professions were organized as they were. They were simply sequences of names and terms, arranged in an order that students were expected to memorize and reproduce with precision. The pedagogical method employed at Nippur and other scribal schools was based on repetition and accuracy. Students began by copying short excerpts from standard compositions, gradually working up to longer and more complex texts as their skill improved. The goal was not to teach students to compose new texts or to think critically about the material they were copying. The goal was to ensure that the next generation of scribes could reproduce the existing corpus without error, preserving the forms and the content that had been transmitted from earlier generations. The curriculum, in other words, was designed to maintain continuity, not to encourage innovation. Among the most frequently copied texts were lexical lists, which organized vocabulary into thematic categories. These lists grouped together terms for types of trees, types of fish, types of vessels, and types of officials, creating a taxonomy of the world as the Sumerians understood it. The lists were not accompanied by definitions or explanations. They simply presented the terms in sequence, assuming that the student would encounter the meanings in context through other parts of the training. The act of copying the lists served to familiarize the student with the vocabulary, but it also transmitted a particular way of organizing knowledge, one that emphasized categories that were already established, rather than categories that might be invented. The god lists copied by scribal students are particularly revealing. These lists enumerate the deities recognized in Sumerian religion, often arranging them according to genealogical or hierarchical relationships. The lists do not describe the attributes or the myths associated with each god. They simply record the names, sometimes with brief epithets, in a sequence that places them within a larger divine structure. The student learning the god list was learning the framework of the pantheon, the order in which the gods were to be invoked, and the relationships that defined their relative positions. The list assumed that the gods existed, that their relationships were stable, and that the student's task was to remember the structure rather than to question it. The same pattern appears in the city lists, which enumerate the major urban centers of Sumer in a fixed order. The lists do not provide historical information about when the cities were founded, or why they were important, or how they came to be connected in a network. They simply present the names, often in sequences that correspond to geographical or ritual relationships. The student copying the city list was learning the mental map of Sumer, a map that was already complete, and that the scribe was expected to internalize as part of the basic knowledge required for administrative and ritual work. The inclusion of the Sumerian King List in the scribal curriculum is particularly significant. Students copied portions of the list as part of their training, and the act of copying reinforced the structure of the list as authoritative. The students learned the sequence of dynasties, the names of kings, and the formulaic language used to describe the transfer of kingship from one city to another. They did not learn where the list came from, or who first compiled it, or on what basis the early reigns were calculated. They learned only that this was the sequence, and that it was their responsibility to preserve it. The curriculum also included professional titles and administrative terminology. Students copied lists of occupations, learning the Sumerian terms for scribe, priest, shepherd, craftsman, soldier, and dozens of other roles. These lists organized the social world into categories, and the act of memorizing them trained the student to think within those categories. The professions were not described as emerging over time or as being subject to change. They were presented as fixed elements of the social order, each with a designated term, each occupying a recognized place within the institutional landscape. The emphasis on copying rather than composition had long-term effects on the Sumerian textual tradition. Because scribal training was based on the reproduction of standard texts, the corpus of Sumerian literature became remarkably stable over time. Compositions that were copied in the early dynastic period continued to be copied centuries later, often with only minor variations in wording or orthography. The stability of the corpus meant that later scribes inherited not only the language in the script, but also the categories, the structures, and the assumptions that earlier scribes had embedded in the texts they chose to preserve. This creates a situation in which the archive, rather than evolving or expanding to incorporate new ideas, becomes a mechanism for the transmission of a fixed body of knowledge. The student entering the scribal school at Nippur was not being trained to explore new questions or to document changes in society. The student was being trained to reproduce what was already known, to maintain the lists that defined the structure of the world, and to ensure that the next generation of scribes would inherit the same framework. The curriculum was a curriculum of inheritance, and the knowledge it transmitted was knowledge of what had been established before the student was born. The content of the lists themselves reinforces this impression. The god lists do not describe the birth of the gods. The city lists do not describe the founding of the cities. The king lists do not describe the origin of kingship. The lists begin with names, proceed through sequences, and end without explanation. The student learns the order, but not the origin. The archive preserves the structure, but not the process by which the structure came into being. The scribal school at Nippur thus functioned as an institution dedicated to the preservation of a particular understanding of the world, one in which the most fundamental categories, gods, cities, kings, professions, were treated as given rather than as products of human development. The curriculum did not encourage students to ask how the pantheon was formed, or how the cities came to exist, or when kingship first appeared. It encouraged them to memorize the sequences, to reproduce the lists, and to ensure that the knowledge they inherited would be transmitted intact to those who came after them. If the scribal curriculum at Nippur was designed to train students in the reproduction of fixed lists rather than in the exploration of origins, and if those lists presented the structure of Sumerian civilization without explaining how that structure came to be, then what does the content of scribal education reveal about the assumptions embedded in the archive itself? In Sumerian and later Akkadian mythological compositions, there are recurring references to a tablet or tablets that contain cosmic decrees, divine laws, or the principles governing the order of the universe. These tablets are not described as being written by the gods, but as existing prior to their use, as objects that the gods consult, guard, or struggle to possess. The most well-known of these references involves the Tablet of Destinies, sometimes referred to in the plural, which appears in several myths as a source of supreme authority. Whoever holds the tablet holds power over the cosmos, not because they have written the laws, but because they control access to what has already been decreed. Enki, the god associated with wisdom, fresh water, and the organization of civilization, is frequently depicted as the keeper of knowledge that predates his own actions. In the myth Enki and the World Order, Enki travels across the land assigning functions to cities, rivers, and natural features, and distributing the me to ensure that each part of the world operates according to its proper role. Yet the text does not describe Enki as inventing these functions or creating the me. He assigns what already exists. He distributes what is already available. His role is administrative rather than creative, and the authority he exercises depends on his access to principles that are treated as prior to his intervention. The Tablet of Destinies appears most prominently in the Akkadian myth known as Anzo, where the tablet is stolen from Enlil, the chief god of the Sumerian pantheon, by a bird-like figure who seeks to use its power to overthrow the divine order. The myth describes the tablet as an object that confers absolute authority. Whoever possesses it can issue commands that cannot be countermanded, can alter the structure of reality, and can determine the fate of gods and humans alike. The tablet is not depicted as a record that Enlil created. It is depicted as an instrument that Enlil holds by virtue of his position, and that can be transferred to another if it is seized or surrendered. The language used to describe the tablet emphasizes its pre-existence. The gods do not consult the tablet to see what they have decided. They consult it to see what has been decided, as though the decrees it contains were established independently of the divine will. The tablet is not a tool for recording new decisions. It is a source of knowledge about decisions that have already been made, by a process or an authority that the myths do not identify. The gods' power is thus grounded in their relationship to a structure of cosmic law that they administer but do not originate. This pattern is consistent with how other divine objects are described in Sumerian mythology. The me, as discussed earlier, are presented as attributes that the gods possess and distribute, but that they do not create. The same is true of the tablets associated with divine authority. The gods are custodians of knowledge, not its authors. Their role is to maintain and enforce the order that the tablets represent, and their legitimacy depends on their continued possession of these objects. When the Tablet of Destinies is stolen, the cosmic order is threatened not because a god has been defeated, but because the instrument through which order is maintained has been removed from its proper place. The mythological emphasis on tablets as sources of authority also mirrors the role of written records in Sumerian administrative practice. Just as the gods consult tablets to determine cosmic law, human administrators consult tablets to verify obligations, confirm transactions, and settle disputes. The tablet, in both contexts, is treated as an authoritative record that exists independently of the individual who reads it. The scribe does not create the obligation by writing it down. The scribe documents an obligation that is understood to exist prior to its inscription. The tablet is evidence, not invention, and the same logic applies whether the tablet records divine decrees or temple rations. The myth of the Tablet of Destinies also raises questions about the origin of divine authority itself. If the gods derive their power from their possession of a tablet that contains pre-existing decrees, then the ultimate source of authority lies not in the gods, but in the decrees themselves. The gods are powerful because they hold the tablet, but the tablet is powerful because of what is written on it, and the myths do not explain where those writings came from. The chain of authority leads backward to a source that remains outside the narrative frame. Just as the chain of administrative authority in Sumerian cities leads backward to an origin that the archive does not document. The association of Enki with the possession and transmission of knowledge reinforces this pattern. Enki is not the creator of the me or of the cosmic order. He is their guardian and their administrator. He knows how the world is structured because he has access to the knowledge that structures it, and that access places him in a position to distribute the me to other gods or to human institutions. Yet the texts do not describe how Enki acquired this knowledge, or where the knowledge was before Enki held it. The knowledge is simply there, embedded in tablets, or in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm associated with Enki, and the god's role is to preserve and transmit what he has inherited. The recurring motif of pre-existing tablets in Sumerian and Akkadian mythology suggests that the gods themselves were understood to operate within a framework of law that they did not establish. The divine realm is governed by decrees, and those decrees are recorded on tablets that the gods consult, guard, and sometimes fight to control. The myths do not describe a moment when the decrees were first written, or a divine assembly where the laws were debated and decided. They describe only the administration of a system that is already in place, already recorded, and already binding on all who exist within the cosmos. If the gods are depicted as administrators of cosmic law recorded on tablets that they did not write, and if their authority depends on their possession of those tablets, rather than on their own creative power, then what does this imply about the Sumerian understanding of the ultimate source of order in the universe? Muel. Apim is the name given to a Babylonian astronomical compendium inscribed on a pair of tablets, likely compiled around 1000 BCE, though the observations it records appear to draw on earlier material. The text is named after its opening entry, the constellation known as the Plough, and it contains a systematic catalogue of stars and constellations, organized into 3 celestial paths associated with the gods, Enlil, Anu, and Ea. The compendium lists 66 stars and constellations, records their heliacal risings and settings, describes methods for tracking time using stellar culmination, and provides instructions for calculating the length of daylight and shadow lengths across the seasons. It is a comprehensive astronomical reference, and it represents one of the earliest surviving attempts to organize celestial knowledge into a coherent written system. What the text does not contain is any account of how this knowledge was first acquired. Apim presents the observations as already made, the constellations as already named, and the methods of calculation as already established. The compendium is based on an earlier tradition known as the 3 stars each lists, which organized stars into 3 divisions corresponding to the northern, central, and southern regions of the sky. These earlier lists, dating back to at least the 2nd millennium BCE, already employed the same tripartite division, and already associated the celestial paths with the major gods of the Sumerian pantheon. Apim thus represents a refinement of an older system, not the creation of a new one, and the earlier system itself is presented in the record without explanation of its origin. The precision of the observations recorded in Apim suggests that the compilers were working within a long-established tradition of systematic skywatching. The text records the dates when specific stars rise or set in relation to the sun, information that requires years of consistent observation to verify and that must be adjusted to account for precession over long periods. The accuracy of the data implies that multiple generations of observers contributed to the knowledge base and that the observations were recorded and transmitted in a form that allowed later scribes to build on what had been established before them. Yet the text does not describe this process. It does not say who the first observers were when the observations began, or how the knowledge was preserved during the centuries before it was committed to cuneiform tablets. The use of the sexagesimal system in Immuel, Apim, and other Babylonian astronomical texts reinforces the connection between mathematics and celestial observation. The division of the circle into 360 degrees, the measurement of time using base 60 units, and the calculation of celestial positions using sexagesimal notation all reflect a sophisticated integration of numerical and observational methods. The system is not introduced or explained in the astronomical texts. It is simply applied, as though the scribes and the readers shared an understanding of how to perform the calculations. The mathematical framework that underlies Babylonian astronomy is the same framework that appears in the earliest Sumerian administrative tablets, suggesting that the system was already in place when astronomical observation began to be documented systematically. The organization of the stars into 3 paths associated with Enlil, Anu, and Ea is particularly notable because it imposes a theological structure onto the celestial sphere. The northern, central, and southern regions of the sky are not simply geographical divisions. They are cosmic territories assigned to specific deities. This implies that the act of mapping the heavens was understood as an extension of the same cosmological order that governed the distribution of the ME and the descent of kingship. The stars are not neutral objects. They are part of a divinely ordered system, and the astronomer's task is to document their positions and movements within that system, not to explain how the system came into being. The star catalog also reveals the practice of assigning divine and symbolic meanings to individual constellations. Many of the stars and groupings listed in AntikeSpuren are associated with specific gods, mythological figures, or ritual concepts. The associations are treated as established knowledge, and the text does not provide explanations for why a particular star is linked to a particular deity. The names and the associations are simply recorded, as though they were part of a shared cultural framework that predated the compilation of the catalog. This suggests that the astronomical knowledge preserved in AntikeSpuren was embedded in a larger system of religious and cosmological understanding, one that the text assumes rather than explains. The compendium also includes instructions for using stellar observations to regulate the calendar and to synchronize agricultural and ritual activities with celestial cycles. The text describes methods for determining the equinoxes, calculating the length of daylight, and tracking the phases of the moon. These methods are practical, designed for use by priests and administrators who needed to coordinate temple rituals and agricultural work with the seasons. Yet the instructions do not describe how the methods were developed, or who first recognized that celestial cycles could be used to measure time. They present the methods as already validated, already reliable, and already integrated into the institutional life of the temple and the palace. The continuity between the earlier 3 stars each lists and the later AntikeSpuren compendium indicates that astronomical knowledge in Mesopotamia was transmitted across centuries with a high degree of stability. The basic structure of the celestial map, the division into 3 paths, and the names of many of the constellations remain consistent across multiple versions of the texts, despite changes in language, political authority, and cultural context. This stability suggests that the knowledge was valued not for its novelty but for its continuity, and that the scribes who copied and updated the texts understood their role as preserving and refining a tradition rather than inventing new systems of observation. Dating from around 1800 BCE, already used Sumerian names for stars, indicating that a body of celestial knowledge was inherited from the earlier Sumerian period. The names were preserved even as the language of the texts shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian, suggesting that the identification of the stars and their associations with particular concepts or deities were considered fixed and authoritative. The archive thus contains evidence of transmission across linguistic and cultural boundaries, but it does not contain evidence of an initial phase in which the stars were first named or the system was first organized. AntikeSpuren, like the Sumerian King List, the temple household tablets, and the lexical lists copied by scribal students, documents a system that is already operational. It records observations that have already been made, describes methods that have already been tested, and organizes knowledge that has already been structured. The text does not explain how the first observers knew which stars to track or how they developed the mathematical tools necessary to calculate celestial cycles, or when the decision was made to associate the paths of the stars with the gods. Enlil, Anu, and Aa. It simply presents the system, and it assumes that the reader has access to the larger tradition within which the system makes sense. If the astronomical knowledge preserved in AntikeSpuren was inherited from earlier Sumerian sources, and if the compendium describes methods of observation and calculation without explaining how those methods were first developed, then what does this imply about the origin of the intellectual tradition that made systematic astronomy possible in Mesopotamia? Sumerian scribes developed techniques for controlling access to knowledge within the texts they produced, and these techniques suggest that silence, the deliberate withholding of information, was understood as part of the scribal craft. Some of these methods involved the use of ambiguous or polyvalent signs that could be read in multiple ways depending on context, making it difficult for an untrained reader to interpret the text correctly, even if they had access to the tablet. Other methods involve the use of specialized dialects, obscure vocabulary, or cryptic formulations that required additional knowledge beyond simple literacy. The archive, in other words, was not designed to be transparent. It was designed to be readable only by those who had been initiated into the scribal tradition. One of the most striking examples of this practice is the use of what modern scholars call trick signs or cryptographic writing. These are cuneiform signs that are chosen not for their most common phonetic or logographic value, but for a secondary or tertiary meaning that only a trained scribe would recognize. A sign might be used to represent a sound or a concept that is associated with it through wordplay, mythology, or esoteric learning rather than through its standard usage in administrative or literary texts. The effect is to create a layer of meaning that is hidden from anyone who has not been taught how to decode the sign, even if they can read cuneiform in its more straightforward forms. The use of trick signs was not accidental or haphazard. It appears in contexts where the content of the text was considered sacred, restricted, or otherwise sensitive. Religious incantations, rituals intended for use by priests, and compositions dealing with divine knowledge often employ these techniques, creating a boundary between public and restricted knowledge. The scribe who inscribed such a text was simultaneously recording information and concealing it, ensuring that the tablet could not be read correctly by someone outside the priestly or scribal elite. The archive in this sense was a controlled space, and the control was embedded in the script itself. Another technique for restricting access to knowledge involved the use of emessal, a dialect of Sumerian associated with certain types of ritual speech and with the speech of goddesses in mythological compositions. Emessal differs from standard Sumerian in vocabulary, grammar, and phonology, and texts written in the emessal would have been difficult or impossible for someone trained only in the standard dialect to understand. The use of emessal in religious contexts suggests that certain kinds of knowledge were meant to be expressed in a linguistic register that was distinct from everyday administrative language, creating a form of linguistic gatekeeping that paralleled the institutional gatekeeping of temple and palace hierarchies. The deliberate use of obscurity is also visible in the structure of lexical lists and other pedagogical texts. These lists often include rare or archaic terms, signs that are no longer in common use, and vocabulary drawn from specialized domains like mythology, divination, or medicine. The inclusion of such material in the scribal curriculum suggests that part of the scribe's training involved learning, not only how to read and write, but also how to recognize and interpret forms of expression that were deliberately opaque. The student was being trained to navigate a textual landscape in which not all information was presented straightforwardly, and in which the ability to decode hidden meanings was a mark of professional competence. The practice of omission, choosing not to record certain kinds of information, can also be understood as a form of scribal silence. As discussed in earlier sections, the Sumerian archive systematically avoids recording narratives of origin for the institutions it documents. The silence is consistent across multiple genres of text and across multiple cities, suggesting that it was not the result of random loss or neglect, but was instead a feature of how the archive was organized. The scribe's responsibility was to document the operation of systems, not to explain their creation. And this division of responsibility meant that certain kinds of knowledge were excluded from the written record by design. The use of polyvalent signs that can represent multiple sounds or concepts also created opportunities for ambiguity that could be exploited by scribes, who wanted to encode multiple layers of meaning in a single text. A sign might be read one way in an administrative context and another way in a religious context, and the reader would need to understand the broader framework within which the text was written in order to interpret it correctly. This polysemy was not a flaw in the writing system. It was a resource that scribes used to create texts that could operate on multiple levels, revealing different meanings to different audiences depending on their level of training and initiation. The existence of these techniques raises questions about what kinds of knowledge the scribes considered too sensitive or too sacred to be recorded in plain language. If trick signs, emessal dialect, and deliberate omission were standard tools in the scribal repertoire, then the written archive cannot be assumed to represent the full extent of what the scribes knew. Some knowledge may have been transmitted orally, some may have been encoded in ways that have since been lost, and some may have been deliberately excluded from the written record because it was understood to belong to a category of information that should not be made accessible to those outside the scribal and priestly elite. The practice of scribal silence also suggests that the archive was understood as serving multiple functions. On one level, it was a practical tool for administration, recording transactions, inventories, and legal agreements in a straightforward manner. On another level, it was a repository of sacred and esoteric knowledge, preserved in forms that required specialized training to decode. The two functions coexisted within the same institutions, and the same scribes who produced routine administrative documents also produced texts that employed cryptographic techniques and linguistic obscurity. The consistency of these practices across centuries and across multiple sites in Mesopotamia indicates that the control of knowledge through writing was a well-established and culturally significant aspect of scribal work. The scribe was not simply a recorder of information. The scribe was a gatekeeper, deciding what to include, what to exclude, what to encode, and what to leave transparent. The archive, as a result, is not a neutral record of Sumerian civilization. It is a curated collection shaped by deliberate choices about what kinds of knowledge should be preserved, in what forms, and for what audiences. The use of trick signs, specialized dialects, and deliberate omission also means that the gaps in the Sumerian textual record, the absence of origin narratives, the lack of explanations for institutional structures, the silence on cosmological beginnings, may not reflect a lack of knowledge on the part of the scribes. These gaps may instead reflect a conscious decision to withhold certain kinds of information from the written archive, preserving them instead in oral traditions, restricted rituals, or forms of esoteric learning that were transmitted only within the scribal and priestly elite. If Sumerian scribes employed deliberate techniques of omission, obscurity, and cryptographic encoding in their texts, and if these techniques were used to control access to knowledge that was considered sacred or restricted, then how much of what the scribes knew about the origins of their civilization was deliberately excluded from the archive that has survived? And where, if anywhere, was that knowledge preserved?